don't really like to talk about solutions to the crisis,
Sure.
but in
Yeah.
as much as there are solutions, they are not going to be one size fits all generic, high tech solutions. They're going to be people like the ones you mentioned, just doing something locally, and that's going to happen in all sorts of different ways. And some of those experiments won't work, other ones will. But that's the mindset that I think needs to be, literally cultivated from
Yes.
the ground up.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Chris Smaje. Chris is a former academic turned small-scale farmer who writes about the intersection of politics, environmentalism, and reclaiming the land through agrarianism, both on his blog and through his books. And he joins me to discuss his latest, Finding Light in a Dark Age. I would say the first half of this conversation, we kind of go through the critiques against that kind of future. People's fears around not having access to certain services like health, whether or not there's enough land, the mass migration that's going to happen through climate displacement, and therefore whether or not an agrarian future would even be feasible. Chris explains the colonial legacy embedded in land expropriation and the ideological narratives that serve to undermine working the land so as to enclose public land, enclose the commons, and create a labour force for a labour market. In the latter part of the conversation, we then turn towards spiritualism, meaning, purpose, and how working the land develops a sense of community, not only with other people, because you need a community to be able to work the land, but also expanding that sense of community to the more than human world and all the creatures with whom we share land and time. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Chris, welcome back to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you here. You are the first person to be back for a third time. How you doing today?
Hi Rachel. Yeah, good to be here, and I hadn't realised that's a real honour. So, looking forward to talking with you.
I think to set the scene, given what we're going to discuss today, your new book, Finding Light in a Dark Age, tell me how the farm is at this moment. It's November in the United Kingdom. What's the farm looking? What kind of work are you doing on it?
Well, it's looking a little bit drab and miserable at this time of year. It's doing okay. Lots of projects. I'm involved in a little building project at the moment, so slightly exhausted from that. We've had a market garden. The main commercial thing we do on the site is a market garden, which I set up with my wife in 2008, and it's still going. Luckily, we have some younger people with more energy and vitality than I now have, who are doing the hard work for it. But yeah, it's great that it's still going, and we've got a little community on the site, which has been interesting and instructive on the social side of things, and lots of people coming and using the site. So as discussed in the book, there's sort of a whole bunch of interesting issues, I think, in terms of how land sits within community and the extent to which we do things sort of individually or in households or in larger groups. So, I don't like to sort of make too big a deal about what we're doing on our site because it's constrained by the world we live in and my own limitations and those of the people on the site. But yeah, it's a sort of very interesting ongoing project just to try and produce a bit of food and fibre, which tends to get missed out. But there's other things we need to produce and grow other than food, so that's part of it as well.
Now, you are an advocate for what you've called the small farm future. That was the title of one of your other books. And essentially, that means returning to the land, working together, stewarding the land as well. Because once we pull the plug out from our fossil fuel infrastructure and all of the fossil capital and the subsidies that are funding it, essentially, our food systems and the way that they currently exist will collapse. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yeah. And not only the food system is a subset of the larger sort of economic and political system. So yeah, and when you say I'm an advocate for a small farm future, it's a sort of complex terrain to navigate because I kind of think that's where we're headed anyway, whether we
Yeah.
like it or not. I'm not just saying, here, this is a cool idea that I think people should follow. I think, yeah, if we design it well, I advocate for a well-designed small farm future because I think it can have, it can be a good form of society and a good life. But if we don't do it by design, I think it'll happen by default in potentially worse ways. So I don't think we have too much of a choice. The choice is about whether we get ahead of ourselves and try and design it well while we can afford to, basically.
I completely agree with you. But people that hold this opinion often get cast as sort of Luddites or neo-Paleolithic, romanticist nut jobs. Um,
Yeah, I've had all that. Either that or a sort of evil Khmer Rouge kind of, sort of autocratic, manipulative. Yeah, I've had all of that.
And it's amazing, isn't it? Because a huge number of the world's population are still living like this. I think it's still that the majority of food is produced by small scale farmers in the world because a lot of the world is frankly too poor to have access to these massively industrialized and subsidized agricultural sort of systems, if you will. So what do you think is happening there? Why is it okay for the rest of the world to do it, but for us in the global north, it's sort of seen as this like violent regression that's unfounded in the realities of how possible or difficult or whatever it would be.
Yeah. Well, it's complicated. I mean, I think, we have this whole progress narrative that is, small scale, sort of local forms of society is sort of how things used to be, and we've kind of dragged ourselves out of that into this better world. And the hope is that we will drag more people out of it in the future. And it's that there's a sort of grain of truth in elements of that, but essentially it's I think it owes more to a particular sort of cultural historical narrative, which is quite problematic and sort of colonialist. It's the sort of the triumph of the West kind of narrative. And the reality is a lot of the move that has happened out of small scale farming has been born out of violence, out of expropriation, and still is, in many ways. And yeah, what's still going on today is a lot of people, the narrative is that nobody really wants to be a small scale farmer. The truth is that nobody wants to be under somebody else's thumb and being kind of screwed all ends up by the system. But that is also true of people working in urban situations. We have this sort of narrative that there was the old medieval sort of city air makes you free, and the reality is that it's much more complicated. There's seasonal labour migration. There's a lot of exploitive urban work, and yeah, you mentioned things like the Luddites. Again, we have this sort of progress narrative that we think of technology as somehow being entirely neutral and divorced from its social context. So, the Luddites were terrible people because they opposed industrialization. The reality is they saw very clearly what that meant, for their lives, for their well-being, and they opposed the social context in which that technology was being imposed. Likewise, the Romantics. I mean, I sort of try and touch on this in some of my writing that the progress narrative has essentially murdered the idea of Luddism, of understanding technology in its context. Romanticism is the idea that a kind of narrow and technocratic view of progress is not the only thing that matters in life. We those terms have become pejorative as a result of this progress narrative, and we're seeing the profound crises that we now face globally have essentially emerged as side effects, if you like, to put it generously, of that progress narrative. It's time to lay that to rest, and to see the way in which it hasn't really liberated people. In many ways, it's oppressed and expropriated people, and we need to. I think we just need a little bit more humility and ability to see how people, try and create material and communal well-being locally, and not to sort of buy into this sort of narrative of progress through urbanization, mass consumption, all of which ultimately, as you alluded to earlier, is driven by very high levels of capital and energy that I don't think are going to be sustainable in the long run. So yeah, I think we need to open ourselves up to other narratives and to critiques of the sort of history of global development, which has been quite colonial and violent, really.
Sure. I mean, land is still, I think, the most valuable asset in the world. And the campaign to seize it from people dates back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And of course, if you demean and you belittle and you undermine people's capacity, but also people's desire to want to be on the land and support themselves, then suddenly you're creating lots of little laborers for the labor market, which needs to exist if single individual people are going to own lots and lots of assets, because they're going to need, hands essentially to work them.
Yeah, there's a lot of land expropriation which is justified on the grounds of human betterment and progress and so on, but as you say, ultimately is about the powerful grabbing land for their own needs, or as you say, sort of proletarianization and the subordinating labor to a different kind of regimen of control, landless labor and what have you. So yeah, absolutely.
And I think that it's always very, very important to remember, as I know you well do, and Silvia Federici's book Caliban and the Witch I thought was really, really good for this. To remember that it happened in Europe first, like not the same levels of violence, not the same, obviously not the racism, not the genocides, but the tools that were then deployed in Latin America in order to expropriate land and assets were tools that were developed on the people within the British Isles and within the what we now call Europe today. We call it the massive land enclosures, the theft of the commons.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a long European history of sort of experimenting with colonialism in our own backyard, and destruction of the commons and sort of labor coercions of various kinds. And yeah, I start finding lights with a case from the Vikings, the Norse expansions, which, as it happens, was prompted by climate change, but We tend to emphasize, the idea of expansion and trade and commerce as being this positive thing. But obviously, in the case of the Vikings, it was also very much associated with raiding and slaving, and which has been another part of the European reality. And it's a little bit more buried in our sort of modern sense of trade and commerce as being positives, but ultimately those generally involve forms of violence as well that kind of militate against the development of a more local ecological society. So that's part of the argument in the book, is that we need to rediscover the virtues of the local and being sort of ecological protagonists within local landscapes, which our commercial ways of thinking tend to militate against.
Oh, that's beautiful. Ecological protagonists within local landscapes. That's a lovely line. Now, Chris, whenever I think about the future, a sustainable future, an ecologically sound future, a future that just makes common sense, the thing that I always eventually sort of wrestle with is the reality that doing so, we are going to have to give up certain things. There are certain luxuries that we will no longer be able to afford. And sadly, some of these luxuries will probably be, around life-saving industries like antibiotics, which we're already essentially destroying anyway from our overuse of them. The possibility of infant mortality rates as well rising in the future, if people are not sort of centralized in these massive urban areas with access to big hospitals and lots of trained people. And it's enough, isn't it, to really put people off that sense of a future. And it's very hard to then talk about what is gained through the abstract, essentially. Like, oh, but you'll get to work for yourself and work with your community and not, spend your entire life within a concrete box. These are values that don't actually, those are the values that we've kind of accepted to live with. And so it's hard, isn't it, to try and convince people that there are some things that we really prize in industrialized society that we might have to not forgo completely, but forego a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot wrapped up in that question that it can be hard to unpick. I mean, in some ways, I mean, you talked about urbanism as being sort of pro human health. The reality is that cities are often incredibly unhealthy places, and it's only through sort of modern kind of high energy methods that they have been made relatively safer. I mean, London in its early development in the 19th century, it was having to draw it. It was so lethal that it needed constant migration from the countryside to keep the population ticking over. And I guess in some ways I would argue that the sort of health and social benefits, I mean, they're beginning to reverse now in many parts of the world, as we see, just such an extraordinary growth in inequality, which is kind of driven by the existing system. I mean, those benefits have always been achieved to some degree, despite the development of modernity and sort of modern capitalism, rather than because of it. So we don't really know what what an autonomous development of that kind of thing would be. Having joked about me being described as a sort of Maoist earlier, I suppose I'll probably compound that by saying, when you look at the achievements of sort of the early Chinese communists in the whole sort of barefoot doctor movement, and this the idea of just basic good public health, hygiene, water, sanitation, and so on, an awful lot can be achieved by regimes that kind of equalize access and take a sort of pragmatic approach to public health. So, for sure, we're not necessarily going to have some of the, sort of really sort of high-tech medical interventions in certain advanced forms of treatment. which, to be honest, are not available for very many people in the world anyway. They're available for pets in the UK and the rich countries, but not necessarily for ordinary people throughout the world. So, I think ultimately, in some ways, I mean, that's part of the argument of my recent book, is that there there will be, as there has always been, a drive towards greater well-being and peace and prosperity, which to some extent has been an urban one in the modern world, but I think won't be that won't be the case so much in the future. So people will ultimately vote with their feet. It will end up being less luxurious to some of us, but perhaps fairer globally if we play our cards right. But I think that's never really been the dominant driver of the system. It hasn't really been ever to improve human well-being. That's been a sort of byproduct for some of us. And I think it's the reality that we face, as I was saying earlier, whichever way we cut the deck, we can't really rely on that sort of very high energy, very high capital, high degree of urban high tech that we've become accustomed to. So, the best thing to do is to sort of try and manage the descent as gently and as fairly as we can. And it will involve not having certain things that we've been accustomed to, but it will generate other possibilities. So yeah, I sort of think that the argument about sort of health and well-being is problematic for some of the reasons I've mentioned. We're beginning to see those systems fall apart already. Even in the wealthier countries. And I think the real thing is to focus on autonomous, bottom-up, grassroots, local public health interventions. Because, I mean, ultimately, health and social care is people-intensive. We need to be looking at sectors that employ large numbers of people in sort of caring and productive work. Low carbon, pro-community work, and health and social care absolutely ticks that box. So alongside the food and the farming and the basic input into material well-being, health and social care, is going to be, always has been, a big part of it. And ideally, we can use knowledges that we've gained more recently to kind of seed that locally. But that's the game that I think we need to be playing.
I agree with you, of course. I do think, though, it's just often one of the first things that people go to, and it's not a necessarily strict belief that the world that we are living in is a healthy one, but the world that we're living in has access to, because it's very often people of a certain class, my own middle class, higher, that go, ooh, but what if I need X? What if I have an emergency? And it's a difficult cliff, I find, to talk people back from that one.
There's a clinician who's occasionally contributed to my blog. I mean, it's not really my main focus of my current work, the sort of health side of things, but one of the things he said, I mean, he's kind of interested in looking at local alternatives to mainstream pharmaceuticals, and, has a very sort of collapse mindset. But one thing he said that stuck in my mind was that I think he's a GP, and he kind of said the patients who are on his list that he almost never sees are a sort of, reasonably well-off, connected, middle-class kind of people who are not, if they don't smoke, or if they're not addicted to various harmful drugs, he almost never sees them. And so that, I think, is a clue of, community connection, purposeful work, equality, relative social equality, exercise, and basic public health, and not isolation and social anomie. It's almost like we generate our own health to a very great degree in a way that we tend not to in contemporary societies. So for sure there will be, individual illnesses and diseases that possibly can be treated now that can't be treated in societies with less spare energetic and financial capital. But I think that's the reality that we'll be facing anyway.
Yeah.
I think we have to sort of make the best of that we can, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what about the claim, and it's a funny one, but what about the claim that there's just not enough land for everyone because our population has exploded thanks to the huge energy surplus that fossil fuels has afforded us over the past 150 years, 250 years?
Right. Well, I mean, the reality of the existing food system is one of enormous overproduction. It's basically, I suppose, again, I think part of the progress narrative that we were talking about earlier is the notion that production is sort of consumer driven, that everything that's produced is somehow needed. Really the system is profit driven. So it's, we've got this enormous agricultural expansion, often into places where there is basically cheap abundant land and or cheap abundant labor, neither of which is necessarily great for the land or the labor. Obviously soy production in Brazil would be an obvious example. And then we try and add value by feeding it to livestock or turning it into biofuels or whatever. So it's a little bit of a misconception that there isn't enough land. It's true that there's a very high population globally. I mean, I've done some sort of fairly back of the envelope exercises, other people have too. I don't think it's the case that there isn't enough land to feed the population. And there's sort of interesting research studies. It's complicated and hard to generalize, but modern agriculture, modern high-tech agriculture doesn't really optimize on productivity per unit land. It tends to optimize on productivity per unit labor or per outputs over inputs. So people who are producing a diverse, healthy, whole food kind of products locally, which we've become so over reliant on a small number of commodity crops, which are not particularly healthy for us in quantity, going back to your health question. So it's not necessarily the case that people can't produce enough food, or that small scale, low energy local farming is less productive than large scale farming. It does require more people on the land, which comes back to your questions about political access to land, really. So yeah, I think that is a misconception, really, that there is a big problem of how do we get from where we are now quickly to where we need to be. So I think most of the really tricky political questions here are about the transition, not about the realities of a more local land-based way of life.
I think sometimes we also forget that it will be different all around the world because different places have different climates. I mean, I was on a piece of land recently. I had the great privilege of being in the Pacific Islands. I was in Samoa on the island of Savaii, and it's a volcanic island, so the soil is crazy. I mean, you just put a banana on the floor on the soil, and 6 months later you have a tree. Um,
Yeah.
and because the land is so abundant, people still have really, really, really big families. I mean, I met someone who was, one of 13 children whose mother had come from one of 17.
Mm.
And pretty much, I think all bar one of those children survived. They were healthy. They worked the land. They had a couple of acres and it was more than enough. So I think we sometimes forget that it's not going to be as hard everywhere in the world as it would be in the British Isles or, the Saharan Desert, like these very extreme climates. For a lot of people, they will need less. You cannot have a sort of cookie cutter size of like everybody is going to need 1.7 acres in order to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, land plus people can be tremendously productive. On the population side of things, there's also, that situation you described is sort of unusual globally at the moment. There's
Hmm.
the fertility rates have been absolutely crashing, but also there's, the existing distribution of population has been very much driven by the needs of global capital, not by a kind of sensible settlement geography in terms of local productivity. So, in a European context, Eastern Europe, for example, there's tremendous agricultural potential in Eastern Europe, but it's either being driven by big scale industrial, as Eastern European countries join the EU, a
Yeah.
lot of quite very well established, successful, smaller local agricultures sort of get a bit trashed, and then you get migration. Because the Western Europe is richer than Eastern Europe. You tend to get population movement away from there. But if we were to look at the world with fresh eyes in terms of potential for local sustainable low energy agricultures, it would look different. And I mean, I talk about that a bit in the book. I mean, that is the European example would be one. North America is another, where populations in the arid West, I think, that is gonna be tougher in the future. Whereas
Yeah.
there's a lot of potential in parts of the Midwest and the Northeast. So I think in better or worse ways, we are going to see population movements over the long term, towards places that are more productive, and promote well-being. The question is how to manage that, and the time periods over which it will occur. But you're absolutely right. Land plus people is intrinsically pretty productive, and I'm not saying that in the face of climate change and water issues and all the other nasties that we're facing, that this is just going to be a kind of easy process that's not going to cause or involve conflict or violence. But I don't think it's kind of fundamentally not on the cards because of the intrinsic productivity of the land. And bear in mind, most of modern agriculture and most of the sort of high-tech whiz-bangery that people like to invoke to solve global problems, or global food production issues, these are all tremendously high capital, high energy solutions, purported solutions that I really don't think are going to cut the mustard. We really need to be looking at these forms of local whole food, diverse productivity, which doesn't get very much investment, because there isn't there's not profit in it. It's almost a kind of anti-profit system. But that's really what we need to be looking at, in my opinion.
It's the decentralizing of our productive capacity also to the land itself.
Right.
But what you've just said raises another really interesting point. I mean, again, I'm in agreement with you that this future is going to come crashing down on us, whether we like it or not. But another concern is, as you said, the climate is changing. The soils are changing. Western Europe is likely going to dry up. Over half of the soil in Africa is going to be desertified before the end of the century. We are going to see mass migrations of populations of hungry people. Within that context, how does a small farm future, how do I put this? Because I don't want to contrast it exactly, but that is going to put pressures as well, especially as we continue to move north into soils that are rockier, have been overexploited by fossil fuel production for a long time, coming from the heart of the imperial core. It's going to make this a little bit more difficult, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, I'm not offering, unlike some, I'm not offering a kind of
Silver
magic
bullet.
solution and say,
Yeah.
snap my fingers and like, yeah, banish the problem of climate change. But I think all of those problems that you've raised are exactly the same if we stick with a kind of industrial global commodity food system, and in fact they'll be worse because those systems don't care about soil or the longevity of soil, or they don't really care about whether people go hungry. They are a kind of profit driven system. So at least with
Yeah.
local agricultures where people are invested in the long term in the places where they live, they do take care of things in that way. Obviously, you're right that we're in this tremendously difficult period in global history, and and it will be getting worse, I think, where the places where people are and the types of agriculture that they've become accustomed to will not be well fitted to the future. So that's where we need to be sort of putting all of our effort and all of our thinking. But the basic possibilities are there. And there's also, I mean, interesting work, for example, in Bangladesh, which is a very climate challenged country. Cassia Poprok is writing, her concept of threatening dystopias, so there's this kind of notion that there's going to be sea level rise and all sorts of nasties. And so there's been this push towards shrimp farming, for example, because it's like, get ahead of the game of sea level rise, and instead of having small scale local rice farming, there's this kind of push towards commercialized shrimp farming, which is doesn't employ many people, is environmentally destructive and probably not very enduring. And so this sort of narrative that we've got to make huge changes because of climate change, and we've got to have these sort of high tech, sort of high input systems, otherwise, the future is bleak. I mean, I can see the logic of that in some situations, but I think ultimately it can just become another logic of enclosure, another, or ultimately a kind of white savior sort of argument that we need to, develop these sort of high-tech, high-energy solutions because people are incapable of solving these things for themselves locally, which in my opinion, is not necessarily the case. Farmers have always been innovative, or always been thinking about how to adapt to changing circumstances, and that's what we need to amplify, that kind of grassroots ingenuity, not a kind of threatening dystopia mindset that then kind of rides roughshod over local adaptation. Which, again, I'd stress is not to say, this is not a rosy picture of the future I'm trying to paint, but I don't see that a kind of local ecological future is any less rosy than the future that we'll arrive at if we just push these kind of industrial cheap food paradigms.
Yeah, we see it in so many industries. I mean, the move to replace fossil fuel energy with renewable energy, quote unquote,
Right.
and that involves ripping up mountains, tearing down forests, burning wood. It's just, I mean, it is the scale at which we're doing it, and to think uncritically about why we're deploying it is just pure madness.
Yeah, I mean that's scale and speed. Yeah, and the not really fundamentally questioning the sort of profit-driven model, which has always been about finding a frontier to exploit. And ultimately riding roughshod over whoever was there, sort of riding roughshod over local arrangements. So. I mean, I'm, much as I love solar panels, I'm, speaking to you here courtesy of the ones on my roof. But yeah, the notion that we can just seamlessly replace a destructive technology with another high tech replacement that is less environmentally damaging, I think. As you say, there's a whole bunch of technical questions that we probably don't want to get into here as to whether that's feasible, but it's also the mindset, that the idea that the problem is only the kind of technical downside of existing technologies rather than the entire sort of cultural, spiritual, economic structure within which it fits. So yeah, we really need to be questioning that more underlying political economy and ultimately, spiritual way of thinking about our place in the world, which is where, I think reimagining ourselves as I said earlier, local ecological protagonists, is really important, I think, in to move beyond that.
Yeah, I really love that, local ecological protagonist. You've made me think of Robert McFarlane's recent book, Is a River Alive? And he opens it with this description through time of plants coming into being and water forming and people coming down and visiting this place, and it turns out it's this small river in England, and it was incredibly sacred, and it was where people came and prayed, and then that was sort of snatched away from them. That relationship with the land that was sort of ideologically embodied through paganism as a belief set was snatched away. And
Mm.
to me, that's part of what is so exciting about this idea of working the land, because now I've got it finally after coming up on 5 years of Planet Critical. Like, I want to do it. It's just the switch flipped in me. It's so obvious now that is a life well spent. The idea of making these relationships with these beings, these biological beings around me that I don't know anything about and that support me, and the idea of being able to support them as well, and just the richness, the possible richness of understanding on a really sort of like practical level, on a lived level, an ontological level, if you will, the complexity, the web
Mm.
of life all
Mm.
around, and actively being involved in that, actively participating in that, rather than being this sort of passive observer who benefits from a machine's manipulation of it. Right? I mean, I think it's a really beautiful thing, and I've got no doubt like doing so just sort of dramatically changes your perception of yourself in the world, of other things in the world,
Yeah.
and your sense of community going
Yeah.
beyond just the human sphere.
Yeah. Again, I mean, so many interesting things wrapped up in what you've just said. That the importance of sacredness, I think, which again sort of goes back to the Luddites. It's just like, no, we need to insist on our community and our forms of worship and connection that are more important than producing something more cheaply.
Yeah.
We need to think of ourselves as being part of wider wholes. And it's sort of interesting. Again, part of the sort of modern progress narrative, we have this sense that all other societies are, utterly miserable, sort of nose to the grindstone, just sort of working just to sort of stay alive. And it's not really true. And so there is always that kind of wider connection and sacredness, and things like Stonehenge. There's obviously everyone's over the years has had all sorts of different theories about it, but as I understand it, the sort of recent archaeological thinking is that that was a collective project of people around the whole of what we now call the UK, from the north of Scotland and everywhere else, coming together, small communities coming together to create this kind of amazing sort of sacred topography and architecture. And these were sort of people in some ways, pioneering agriculturalists, but still they had the capacity, the surplus generating ability to spend time, toting these enormous stones around the country. So the sort of notion that only modern people have the leisure or the surplus generating capacity to engage, both at a sort of sacred human level and also at an ecological level, is not true, you know. So yeah, again, we need to, you know, just get over ourselves a bit and our sort of modern self-congratulation, I think.
It is that you mentioned the word humility at the beginning, and it is a huge part of it, and I think it is this deep colonial narrative and a racist narrative of that's not what we do, that's what
Mm,
other people do, that's not what we do. We you know we find purpose and meaning, and we write the laws of the universe, and we come up with the grand theories and establish nations, and
yeah.
on all this fucking crap, excuse my French.
Well, I found that it's funny. I mean, there's sort of been in terms of the racism, obviously in recent years, there's been a re-evaluation of indigenous and sort of foraging hunter-gatherer
Mhm,
peoples. But
mhm,
again, I talk about it a bit in the book, you know, it's almost like that's okay for them, for these other
mhm,
people. You know, we're happy for them to be doing the indigenous hunter-gatherer thing, or, you know, the local agriculture thing. So I guess my argument is, well, if it's great for them to be doing it, why not those of us that, you know, can't call ourselves indigenous in that? I mean, the whole term indigenous needs a huge amount of unpacking, but,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
but if it's all right for them, why not us? And then it's like, oh no, but you're being romantic and
Uh-huh.
nostalgic, you know.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, we again, that does come from this implicit notion of yeah, you know, it is a colonial notion. It's a notion of progress and technology, and to some extent also driven by you know, the critique that you mentioned earlier. You know, can we produce enough? You know, it's fair enough, we need to get into those questions, but
Mhm.
you know, we need to do it um sort of thoughtfully, and not just with this knee-jerk assumption that, oh, you know, we can't, you know, we can't turn the clock back, or we can't produce enough. You know, all of these things really are kind of um, sort of ideological elements of a progress narrative that don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. I mean, you know, as I keep stressing, I do recognise the enormous difficulties of transition from where we are now. But we need to embrace that, because if we don't, you know, the transition will happen anyway, just in worse and more violent and more problematic ways.
Mhm. Mhm. When we were on our travels through South America for Planet Coordinate, we visited Cali, and a really urban, sort of ghettoized part of Cali, that's filled with Afro-Colombians that have been displaced from other parts of the country thanks to violence, guerrilla warfare, all of this kind of stuff, and sort of congregated in Cali and not given much support whatsoever, if any, quite frankly. And Colombia is a very hot place. Cali is a very hot city. There are almost no green spaces in this sort of ghettoized area, and everything is very expensive. And in the 90s, in the midst of sort of the guerrilla warfare that was actually happening on the streets there, a couple of teenagers called themselves Gardeners for Peace and began planting big trees. Well, little seedlings, but they are now these really big trees, and they provide shade in this sort of corner. Which is near a marshland, and so there's some rivers or water, and that's why they've been able to grow. And one of those teenagers was shot and killed in the violence. And to sort of commemorate what he'd begun with his friends, people kept tending this garden and growing it over the years. And when you visit now, it is this sort of like pretty wide strip, but a strip nonetheless, uh, bordering onto some marshland and then bordering onto just concrete road and pavement. And it's pretty long. And it's an urban garden, and it's feeding the 17 people that work it, that have
Hmm.
no chance of employment and therefore no chance of money to feed themselves or their children. They produce a surplus that they give away to the community. It's a really extraordinary feat. And for me, it helped sort of redefine what is possible when it comes to land, because I think part of coming from the imperial core and growing up in this sort of progress narrative, it's like, if you're going to do anything, you have to do it big. you have to do it on massive scale. And so
Yeah.
for me, it's like, well, I can't afford to buy land and grow my own food. That's never going to be available to me. And then seeing these people and interviewing them, I mean, I was just like, well, of course we can. There's so many different bits of land around the place that could be made, that could produce fruit trees or
Mm.
berries. And sure, probably not enough to like sustain you completely, but enough to really, 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 really make a difference.
Yeah.
And it's that reoccupying, isn't it, of like public spaces that should belong to us and should make sense and should be productive in a
Yeah.
way that benefits community health, and that are just being left to rot, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much that that can be done in terms of repurposing urban and community spaces, and part of it is about the community building aspects of it as well as any food production. But
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I mean, again, I think I don't really like to talk about solutions to to the
Yeah, sure.
crisis, but in
Yeah.
as much as there are solutions, they are not going to be one size fits all generic high tech solutions. They're going to be people like the ones you mentioned, just doing something locally, and that's going to happen in all sorts of different ways. And some of those experiments won't work, other ones will. But that's the mindset that I think needs to be literally cultivated from
Yes.
the ground up. Absolutely. And it does happen in those situations like you mentioned, situations of extreme stress and poverty, or in moments of political crisis, like the Greek financial crisis, or in Argentina, or people often talk about the food production in Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these crises tend to be relatively short term, and then the sort of global system sort of imposes its normality on them again. But I think what we're looking at in the future is less of that normality, more of these crises which are going to be deeper and more enduring. And that's when I do have faith, like the people you mentioned in Colombia, in people to get organized and start solving some of their problems, and that's what we need to some of their problems locally. That's what we need to amplify and build a larger movement and a larger kind of intellectual frameworks around that help to amplify it, in my opinion.
I completely agree with you. And I think that's probably the note that we should end it on. Because whatever happens, and this everyone I speak to at the moment, everyone is just like, it's a hyper local future. That's what it's got to be. That's what it's going to be, no matter
Right,
what.
right.
If we can plant the seeds now, we might be able to get ahead of the curve. You can't do anything hyper locally alone. It's going to have to be communally based, and it will solve. There will be different problems that come up, but it will solve for a lot of the issues caused by modernity. I mean, the mental health and physical health crisis sort of being the two big ones.
Right.
And I do think that it's exciting. Like, how many young people? Okay, I remember being this young person. So maybe it wasn't all young people, but I remember being the young person that sort of idolized the Beat Generation, before I actually read their biographies. Um, or romanticized about a time when it was still possible to be wild, to
Mm.
be anonymous, to move through the world invisibly, to go unseen, to go from place to place. And that felt completely gone in a world of surveillance, quite frankly, and increasingly so. And
Mm.
yet to live hyper locally in your community doing that, it's a way to kind of reclaim that. It's a way to reclaim that wildness and
Yeah.
all the possibilities that open up with it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's who knows how it will all pan out. We could talk about a world of drones and cameras and surveillance and hyper autocratic governance, which I mean I do touch on that in my book. But obviously, the what I would love to amplify is exactly that world that you're describing, and I think
Mm.
it will be possible, because it's impossible for centralized states to sort of control all of the territory, and political power, it's not just material, it's not just in the weapons and the drones and so on, it's in the ideas and the the way that it co-opts people. So I think, it's really important to try and break out of that kind of, these progress narratives, or these narratives of state corporate technological control, because at least half the battle, if not more of it, is a battle of minds and culture and spirit, as well as technologies and energy and capital. So yeah, hopeful for your vision of the future. Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if I'm hopeful for my vision of the future, but I'm determined. I have an angry, determined sort of sense of
Well, I think
compulsion.
Determination, anger, and hope rather than optimism. I mean, I think I often distinguish between those two. I think there's a need for sort of hope that motivates us to sort of work on improving the world, whereas a sort of airy optimism that it'll all be all right because of technology X, I think is something to guard against.
So go and get your hands dirty, everyone. That's a note to end on. Chris, my final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Right. Well, if I could be cheeky and mention two people, I don't know if you've interviewed them already, but we've been talking about the sort of big picture and the local picture. So I think Jo Goldie, historian, she wrote a book, The Long Land War, which I think is brilliant, and it really emphasizes, it kind of cuts against this progress narrative that, I mean, she talks mostly about the sort of British Empire and the end of it in Ireland and India, but so much of that was about people having the right to have a bit of land to cultivate, and she sort of draws that out over a sort of long historical period brilliantly. And then coming from the other angle, from the local, Carwyn Graves, Welsh food writer, he's just done some brilliant books, and his thinking I find really informative about just how deep the interpenetration of sort of Welsh language and culture and landscape and farming is, and it's all become very politicized in terms of the sort of the so-called rewilding debate and sort of arguments about upland sheep in Wales. And what Carwyn shows brilliantly is that as around the whole world, every region has been pushed agriculturally to overproduce the handful of commodities that it can most advantageously sell into global markets. But beneath that, there's an enormous diversity and very finely grained histories of agriculture and landscape interaction, which is almost there waiting to be rediscovered. It hasn't really gone away for all the for all the onslaughts on it in modern times. So Carwyn's thinking and writing, I think, really tangibly gives that sense of possibility of localism, bringing about new possibilities built on old possibilities, which is a key point, I think.
How absolutely beautiful. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your work. It's always great chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It's a pleasure talking to you as well.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.